Yeah, but why don't I just get to what I want to talk about, which is some recent work we've done on multi-legged slipping and multi-legged locomotion in general. And folks at Penn will recognize the intellectual lineage of a lot of things I learned here at Penn that's feeding into this work. So that's the general structure of what I'll be talking about, but rather than enumerating it, let's just get to it. And I'll start by crediting the people who helped me in this work. I learned a lot about a lot of these methods from Professor Ross Hatton, who's a really lovely guy who did a lot of work on geometric mechanics and collaborated with Professors Glenna Clifton and Nick Gravish on some of the data set. My former students, Brian, Matt, and Dan, and my current student, Gio, all contributed here. And so Matt, there will be a shout out to you. Let me first talk about how we build models of locomotion systems. And here, there's this great idea that came by some people you know, their names are Dan Kodachek and Bob Full, of this idea of templates and anchors. So when we try and build models of animals, or robots, we can have very detailed models like the model on the right, which was literally made by slicing a cockroach and building a 3D model of that individual cockroach. Or we can go all the way to abstracted spring mass systems like the lateral leg spring. This sort of range is called going from templates to anchors, templates being the abstracted models and anchors being more strongly tied to the morphology and the specifics. And I think the best introduction to that sort of thinking is in a fairly recent book by Inspired Legged Locomotion, edited by Seyfarth. And Matt and I contributed 2 chapters there on templates and anchors and locomotion as an oscillator. And the locomotion as an oscillator idea plays a big role in the work you'll see here. And really the idea here is the idea of phase reduction. So this is one of the big simplifying ideas in dynamical systems. And the idea is that, and I grayed out the technical stuff, I'm not even going to read it. The template is some subspace inside the anchor. But the dynamics on the template are semi-conjugate to the dynamics on the anchor. And what that implies in the end is that if you're converging onto the template, the dynamics on the template tell you what happens after transient decay. That's a very important idea because it means that there's a lot of bustle in the physical universe that we're trying to remove from our models and look at what happens long term that's going to govern the behaviors we want to either control or model. And so this is the idea of phase reduction. And I spent an inordinate time as a grad student trying to do that sort of modeling on cockroaches. And this is a video that people have seen me show for 10 years, where I actually show that a running cockroach is an oscillator. What's an oscillator? An oscillator is a loop in state space that is stable. And you see the projection of the state of the cockroach on the left on its 2 principal components. And that's that rotating dot up top. Okay, so that entire cockroach is behaving mostly like an oscillator. It's occupying a loop in state space. Its entire state collapses to a single phase variable where we are on the cycle. That's all you need to know, for the most part, to know what the cockroach is doing at any point in time while it's running. That's a really great reduction from the complexity of that system. The other big reduction idea we have in dynamical systems and physics is the idea of symmetry reduction. So symmetry reduction comes from the important fact that physics is in our minds and not in the universe. And so the laws of physics are reference frame invariant. If you write the state of your system in terms of its reference frame, a body frame, and its shape, you split it into 2 parts. The dynamics split up. The frame velocity, the way the body moves through space, depends on the shape. But it doesn't depend on the frame because the laws of physics can't depend on the frame. So the shape velocity depends on the shape. The frame velocity depends on the shape. It's a triangular structure. You can remove a bunch of complexity. And so basically says this is a formal way of saying the intuitive notion that your equations of motion can be written in body coordinates and reduced by the dimension of the symmetry of the environment. And what does that actually look like? Geometric is governed by what's called in geometric mechanics. The general form is what's called the Reconstruction Equation, which takes the form of the equation you see here. G inverse G dot is the body velocity of our system, where G is a pose in 3D space. And here R is the shape. And so there's a dependency on shape velocity on R dot, and a dependency through the inertia on a momentum. But this momentum is not the momentum you're used to from your high school physics or from your advanced dynamics class. It's not a high dimensional momentum. It's a momentum that's only of the dimension of the underlying symmetry. So the momentum here, the group momentum, is actually pretty low dimensional. This is saying something pretty profound. What it's saying is that assuming you control and measure the shape of your animal or robot, the actual dynamical part is only 6-dimensional. It's only the motion of the body through the world. If you can control the shape of your body perfectly, and you're in a symmetric world, then the way you move is pretty low dimensional. The equations are much, much simpler. And so this tells us that really there are 5 kinds of movement. The simplest kind of movement is really non-movement. It's what's called holonomic movement. If my foot here is planted in the ground and I change the shape of my body, you can know how my center of mass is moving just by knowing the shape of my body. You don't need any dynamic equation. The shape just maps into where my body frame is. Unfortunately, my foot stays planted and I can't move anywhere. So the next thing I need to do is change which foot I'm using. And that gives us piecewise holonomic motion, which is a lot of what actual animals do and robots do. And then you can get into even more complexity. And this has been studied before. It's what's called Stoxian motion. It's going to be a big part of this talk. It's what happens in low Reynolds number swimming and slithering. So it's been known to happen there. It's where friction controls everything and just the shape change alone moves you. Matt taught us that there's an additional regime there next to Stoxian motion called perturbed Stoxian motion, where momentum decays quickly rather than just not being there at all. And then eventually you build up enough momentum where the relationship between the body velocity and the shape actually depends on the value of your momentum. And so you no longer have any reduction at all. You're in full dynamics. So there's a sort of nested structure of piecewise holonomic motion, Stoxian motion, and perturbed Stoxian motion that are all related to each other. And they are the subject of this talk, really. And I do want to point out that piecewise holonomic motion is a kind of Stoxian motion. So you see this bug walking around. When its legs are on the ground, you can map the location of the center of mass from the shape of the body. So this is a piecewise holonomic motion. But I can just take that equation on the left, which says the frame of the center of mass is a function of the shape, and differentiate it. And I'm going to get an equation on the right that looks like that A of R dot. There's a matrix multiplying R dot, and that matrix depends on the shape. So piecewise holonomic motion is always a special kind of Stoxian motion. But Stoxian motion is fairly obscured and understudied, and I hope I'll convince you today it shouldn't be so understudied. There's value in it. So here's one thing we did with it. And that is the idea of optimizing gaits for Stoxian system. So a Stoxian system is governed by the connection. And a while back, Hatton and his co-authors figured out that you could actually just measure the connection on a robot. They built this snake robot, they put it in a ball pit. They had it wiggle around through all possible shapes. It's a 2-dimensional shape space, through all possible shape velocities. So it's a 4-dimensional space that they are exhaustively searching. And they measured the connection just empirically. How did the body velocity change in each of these? Compute that matrix and learn it. The problem is that's a very high dimensional space to grid. Even for a 2-degree of freedom robot, that's a 4-dimensional space to grid. And so my student Brian and I came up with the idea of using phase reduction, phase estimation, to build a local model of the physics instead of a global model of the physics. So we have a gate. The gate is a cycle through state space. Along the cycle, there's one variable which causes nonlinear changes because it changes in large scale. But perturbations slightly off the gate are small. And because they're small, we can use a series approximation to build the connection's dependence on these small perturbations. And this gives a huge win because we're basically sampling a 1-dimensional space regardless of the dimension of the ambient shape space. We're only sampling along the cycle. So it's a big win in high dimensions. And now that we have a local model of the physics, we can use that local model to optimize how we move. And so instead of doing 1,000 experiments on the robot, we do one short experiment on the robot, build a model of the physics, and then do 1,000 numerical experiments to figure out how to improve the robot's policy of motion. Why is this a good idea? We often don't know the physics. If we tried to do this with a robot, this many iterations, the robot would break because gaits are very high dimensional objects. The policy space is very high dimension. So we get a local model using quick and safe experiments, and we then simulate to get the gradient of the gait against that model, and then do an optimization step. So how does this happen? We take our shape R and we split it into 2 variables, theta our phase variable and delta our perturbation variable. And now we take that connection model, AFR R dot, partition these coordinates, and do this very sophisticated approximation called Taylor series to the first order, and split A to A and its gradient approximation. We end up with 4 terms, a big regression matrix, and we do this separately at every phase along the cycle. That's it. This is the learning algorithm. It's called linear least squares. Here's what we get. We start out with a very simple gate. The policy space here is dimension 264. We do a few iterations of this. So 30 cycles of wiggling. This simulated wiggling has some noise in it. It's a stochastic system. So it's rich enough to allow us to see a lot of different deltas. And we learn a policy that has dimension close to 300. In just about 10 iterations. Okay, this is very fast. And so if you think, well, sure, we did this once, maybe we cherry picked it. So we did it many times with different levels of noise. We initialize the system with different joints moving. We always end up with the same solution. So you see here 4 different batches of simulations with different levels of noise. They end up all with the same optimal cost of transport, which is what we're optimizing here for this swimming simulation. Interestingly enough, with different solutions at approximately the same cost of transport, the larger the noise, the more dramatic the motions the optimizer found, presumably to resist being corrupted by the noise. But the optimality of the result is pretty much the same, and the rate of convergence is pretty much the same. But as anyone who's in GRASP knows, theory is only worth so much. You need to actually try this on a real robot. So we did that too. So this is actual video of the entire optimization process for a 5-segment wheeled snake. We just skip the part where we reset the snake. So it's the exact same kind of simulation as you saw, exactly the same kind of display as you saw for that simulation, but now in a physical snake. The objective function here is actually written on the y-axis of the bottom right graph. It's x minus alpha theta squared is our goal function. So maximize x while not letting your rotation get too big. And within 10 iterations, we have a nice slithering motion on a physical robot. Now, this is not simulation. So that already made us pretty happy, but everyone kind of knew that snakes do this. They do geometric gaits. But then something strange happened. And that is, we're trying to think, well, we like working on multi-legged systems. There's a lot of friction there. Maybe there's no momentum. Maybe we can use the same approach. So we tried to write a really simple model of a legged system. So the model here is just, there's a robot, it has legs that it moves in its body plane, and they stick straight down into the ground, and they're springy legs, and some of those legs will contact the ground and generate friction forces. And you try and write these equations of motion, and unfortunately, they don't look like a connection at all. Coulomb friction just ruins everything. And so I did this thing which physicists have taught me to do years ago, and that is sometimes you just throw physics out the door and you do what's called an ansatz. You just change the math to work. Okay, what did I need to change? Well, all I needed to change is remove the hat from the v and add the vector sign back. So rather than have a velocity that's a unit vector, just have the force scale with the velocity as well. Tiny change in the algebra, completely unjustified by the physics. And we thought, okay, let's try it. Let's see what happens. This is the sort of thing that makes you really worried when your results work really well for reasons that you know are wrong. Okay, so what you see are theta dot y dot x dot for the robot experiment and the simulation for our six-legged robot, which, by the way, should seem very familiar to GRASP people because this was a design made by folks in Mark Yim's lab. It also worked for our other six-legged robot that you see in white. And then we asked some folks in Harvard to give us their quadruped robot data, and it worked for that robot too. So at that point, we got pretty worried that something's going on here where we're getting the right results from the wrong physics. And so some generous folks at the DoD funded us to build this robot, which has six-axis force torque measurement cells, one for each leg. So we can actually measure the ground reaction force of every single leg as a function of time and find out whether we got the right answers for the wrong reasons because somehow the Coulomb forces combined to look like viscous friction, or whether the friction model was wrong, which you can't tell unless you can actually look at the contact forces. Turns out calibrating that sort of system is very, very hard. And it took my grad students about a year and a half to do. But I'm happy to say that it's now nicely calibrated. How do you know it's calibrated? Because as we're walking in a tripod gait, you see this nice, lovely square function, excuse me, where the normal force is exactly mg, and it's the same on both tripods of legs. Everything looks nice. And then we designed a gait that will have a lot of slipping in it, so that this won't work just because we're doing some piecewise holonomic motion. So here's the gait we designed. You see how much slipping all these legs do. And guess what? The prediction's really good. So the blue line you see here is the motion tracking data. The orange line is our ansatz model. And the green line is what you get if you actually do Coulomb friction. And so our ansatz, which has completely the wrong physics, gives us basically the same answer as Coulomb friction. And it turns out that the contact force, in fact, is Coulomb friction. So what we did here is we divided the horizontal force by the normal force and look at it as a function of velocity. And you see this nice clear step function, which is exactly what you want to see in Coulomb friction. So now the question is, okay, are we predicting the right contact forces? Well, the answer is yes. Measured force, sometimes not predicted so great, but the ansatz model and the Coulomb friction model give almost exactly the same answer. Okay. So what's going on here, right? Something fishy is going on, especially since the problem in the ansatz is a linear problem. So you just invert a 3x3 matrix, it runs about 20 times faster than trying to solve the Coulomb friction problem. It's just a matrix inversion. And so this is great. So we now have a way of simulating this multi-legged motion using a much simpler representation. It's the wrong physics, but it gives the right answer. How far can we push these computation speed improvements? Well, formally speaking, this sort of problem, G inverse G dot is some function of t, is solved by what's called computing an ordered exponential. So you can't just take the right-hand side, integrate it, and do the exponent of that because we're living on a curved space on the group of rigid body motions. What you end up with is this sort of extended product of pieces. So this is not the exponential of the integral. This is this limit of Riemann subdivisions of the path. Yeah. No. This is all vector. So this sort of depends on how you choose to write your G. If you're writing G as a matrix, then A is a matrix in little SE3. Okay. No, they don't commute. That's exactly the point. This is why you can't do the exponential of the integral, because they don't compute it. If it was a commutative group, you could do that. Yeah, this is spot on. But what is true is that if you look at these contributions, each of the contributions in this integral can be computed in advance, because unlike regular Newtonian dynamics, I didn't need the integral of the past to know what the contribution of a particular part of my motion plan is going to be. A of t is dictated by me. I am dictating the shape of the robot over time. So I can compute all of these in parallel and then combine them in logarithmic time. This is what parallel architectures allow us to do. Is we can compute all of these matrix contribution together and then combine them in pairs hierarchically, and that's in log time as a function of the planning horizon. So we can do motion plans on multi-legged systems with slipping in log time instead of linear time. That's lovely. So of course, you hear that, you immediately say, okay, we need to do this on a GPU. And so we did that. We wrote an implementation using something called Numba, which allows you to, it's a JIT compiler for Python. It supports array operations and has both CPU and GPU targets. So on CPU, we get about 0.1 milliseconds per compute step. GPUs are slower per compute steps. They're about 13 times slower, but we have 8,000 cores. So we get about a 600 times speed up. So we got a 20 times speed up.
So you have to tell something about the relationship with the horizon, because you have to tell us a little bit more about how much of a horizon you need to compute, because even logarithmic time can be pretty bad if you're trying to get this approximation.
Well, so the question is, how much real time does a single time step correspond to? If I understand your question, is that it?
The horizon over which the approximation can work for any finite number of products, right?
So are you asking about how this accumulates error? So in terms of the numerics, how much it accumulates error, I honestly don't know. Okay. In terms of the,
okay, that says that works brilliantly well for all the practice.
yeah, pretty much. We've not seen anything that was painful, but all we've looked at are the graphs I've shown you, and in the graphs I've shown you, our predicted results are within 2% of the measured behavior of the robot. So if you want to know what's our relative error, it's about 2% for our particular robots. That's what I can commit to. But that's per time step 2% error. Does it accumulate? Is it decorrelated or correlated? I don't know. So we get about 600 times speed up by using a GPU. We got another 20 times speed up by using our ansatz. That's starting to look pretty good. So this is for Stoxian systems. What other kind of systems might there be that are Stoxian? So we showed some of this for legged systems, but I really had to include this, which is where Matt showed us that systems can be Stoxian even when there's a little bit of momentum. So here you see a simulation of a swimmer in a viscous system. The red is the fluid dynamics simulation. The green is modeling it as a perturbed Stoxian system using the methods that we developed. And blue is if you just model this as purely viscous motion. So it gets some really nice results, even in finite Reynolds numbers where viscosity isn't huge. So rather than modeling a bacterium, this could be a model of a worm or a really quickly slithering snake. But then we observed that this actually also works for soft robots, and here's how. So let's say we split our shape space into two parts. There's a part we can control, and there's a part that's passive. And the passive part, the passive part is governed by some sort of spring damper behavior from the active part. So what we do in that case is split up our forces and torques, our wrenches as well, into passive and active wrenches. We do know that for a broad class of systems, the external interaction is going to look linear in the shape velocity. So we'll assume linear drag forces from the environment, basically. And then we look what happens when we do the algebra on this. So for Stoxian systems, in general, the passive torques depend on the shape velocity, and the actual body velocity. But the actual body velocity itself depends on the connection. So we can remove it out. So it depends on shape and shape velocity. We solve these equations and we basically get a result, which is that the passive degrees of freedom have a velocity that's affine in the active controlled degrees of freedom. And the motion itself is affine in that as well. So if the interaction in the body between active and passive degrees of freedom is just spring dampers, we end up with a really simple class of behaviors for shape under-actuated distributive systems. Yes?
If they're not well damped, thanks. If they're not well damped, this is you're probably not going to get benefit.
That's true. They need to be well damped. These are over damped but passive. You are spot on. Over damped but passive soft systems so actually have this behavior. So the body velocity actually ends up still being driven by a connection, but now only from the controlled part. So what we have added, though, is we have this offset velocity V0, which also depends on the shape. So it becomes affine instead of linear. But we get this very simple behavior, which is basically no more complex than the non-under-actuated system, than the fully actuated system. Why did it become simple? It became simple because there are these linearizing coordinates, which are the passive degrees of freedom depending linearly on the active degrees of freedom. And so we tried this on a bunch of models. I won't belabor the obvious, just to say that it worked pretty well. If you want to see perhaps the most surprising one is the bottom model on the left. So this is a 9-segment worm driven by 2 motors at the end. And we get a pretty good model. Okay, so this sort of data-driven way of learning the connection works learning the body velocity as a linear map of the shape velocity as given by these 2 motors, even though there are all these other passive degrees of freedom. So it suggests that learning how to move with underactuated flexible bodies is actually a lot easier than we previously thought, as long as you're friction dominated, as long as you're overdamped. So the question is this a new way to think about modeling motion for animals and robots in general? And I remind you, there's sort of these 3 kinds of motion that we're talking about that all have the same mathematical structure. So the piecewise holonomic, the Stoxian motion, and the perturbed Stoxian motion all have the same algebraic structure. When you actually go and do the regression, you're going to get basically the same computation. So we compared some animals, ants, and I won't talk about the cockroaches. We compared ants. And we also looked at our robots, both the 6-legged robot class that you saw before, and another large class of robot, which again should be eerily familiar to folks in Mark Yim's lab here because they come from their designs originally. And the ant data came from my wonderful collaborators who collected this truly stunning data set of 2 million frames of ant motion. So lots and lots and lots of ant data. Which we then did phase analysis on, cleaned up, and split into multiple categories, actually 12 categories, as follows. So we have going mostly straight, turning right, turning left, that's one axis, and then speed, 4 quartiles. We ignore the lowest quartile because when ants are walking very slowly, they do a whole bunch of behaviors that aren't just locomotion. But they can be walking 2nd quartile, 3rd quartile, 4th quartile of their velocity. It turns out, as you'd expect for systems that are following, what you'd expect of systems that are following geometric mechanics is that regardless of the speed they're going through the same shape changes over time. And what you see here is that going forward, the slow motion and the fast motion basically have the same shape as a function of phase. They're, for all intents and purposes, indistinguishable. The ants are acting like little robots that are just doing the same shape much faster, but going through the same set of shapes when they're going fast versus slow. So this is the component of motion of the leg parallel to the body axis, which is most of the motion that the leg is doing. Okay. And so now we go and we use the same methods we use to build data-driven models of connections on the ants on the category that's marked in orange. We just take mid-speed ants moving forward. And now we use that model to predict all the other motions. So we build a model of the physics based on a restricted behavior. And now we see whether we can extrapolate it to other speeds and other behaviors. And we managed to explain about 50 to 60% of what we see. So a pretty good model by standards of biology by just looking at one behavior that had enough variability to allow us to build this data-driven physics model. Okay. So we can try and do the same for, this is a different behavior for a robot. This is a tripod turning gait. We did a bunch of work on steering gaits for this robot, and we use the data set for that. You see in this data set that the shape of toe motion is independent of the speed of the robot. This is just overlaid a whole bunch of different speeds. And now we look at, okay, how far does the robot move as a function of its speed and steering parameter, where what would we expect if the motion is geometric? So geometric motion has this property. If you're governed by a connection, it has this property that the distance you travel per cycle is going to be exactly the same regardless of the speed, because there's no momentum carrying you forward. It's just your shape change that's pushing you forward. And what you see is that the distribution of results are basically horizontal. There's almost no slope. There is a significant, statistically significant slope, but the effect size is very small. And the intercept of these lines is really not the origin, which is what you'd have if you're completely governed by momentum. So momentum plays a very small role. And we do the same modeling for a robot and get essentially the same result, which is if we train on the behavior of the robot going straight, excuse me, not going straight, doing a moderate turn. Here, all the motions are turns. Doing a moderate turn, there's enough variability in that to give us a model of the physics that then extrapolates to going faster, going slower, turning more, turning less. And so we're wondering, well, how much is this geometricness extending to other multi-legged systems? So we built the whole family of multi-legged systems. This is the multipod robots. We built them going from 4 legs all the way to 12 legs and explored a bunch of different gaits where the different gaits are different phase offsets between the legs. What you see on the right is there's a lot of slipping going on. The colored areas you see on the plots on the right, these are plots of the robot feet on the ground. The colored areas are where those legs are slipping. There's a lot of slipping here. This is the sort of stuff that people really don't like modeling in their mechanical simulation, where you have multiple contacts and a lot of slipping going on. Is this behavior geometric? Well, it turns out all of it falls on a single master curve. So all the robot sizes, all the speeds we tried, distance per cycle is only a function of the phase offset between the legs. That's it. If you look at this master curve that we have on the top left, this governs the distance per cycle. And after you look at this, after you subtract this phase dependence, phase offset dependence, which is basically which gait we're using, the dependence on frequency is very small until we hit the highest frequencies we could with this robot. And then it starts being significant. That's the top middle plot. And there's no effect on the number of legs. So 6, 8, 10, 12 legs have exactly the same behavior. So what have we seen here? Well, multi-legged slipping has Stoxian connection models. It behaves basically like slithering. Using the ansatz we came up with and a GPU, you can get a X1000 speed up on simulating these systems. They're much, much easier to model than you think. And they're easy to learn from the data. And these models apply to both animals and robots. Now, what I wonder as a biologist is, if you look historically, evolutionarily, all the bilaterally symmetric animals we see started out from these little worms that were yay long and were swimming in basically high friction environments. And so it may well be that the place we first learned how to move is this regime, the regime of Stoxian motion. And that is the foundation for learning how to move. And that was a lot easier than we think now. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Shai, for that talk. I don't know, we should maybe take questions from the audience, and then Weishi, you have, are there things coming in on the hybrid end?
We'll give it some time.
Okay.
Hi, Shai. Thank you for this really interesting talk. I'm really curious if you've looked at surfaces that are flat but inclined slightly and how that would affect the motion and slipping, because it would affect the distribution of forces. So I'm curious if these models are able to account for that.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that will happen is, of course, if you tilt the ground, you're changing the symmetry of the problem. And so there will be a dependence of the dynamics on your angle to that tilted axis. And we are looking at it now in the context of stair climbing. So yes, but no results yet.
Shai, I missed the 2-3 slides, the first 2-3 slides. How do you define the shape? Is it like an articulated shape where you define a kinematic tree, or what is the actual definition of shape here?
Okay, so you're asking what is the mathematical definition of shape?
Yes.
So formally speaking, shape is the quotient of your state space by your symmetry.
Okay.
We've got a question from the chat. CJ Taylor says, great talk. I was wondering whether as you adjust the gaits on the robot for optimization, are you updating the model continuously?
Yes, and in fact, that is sort of what I was trying to illustrate in this video, is we build a model for one gait, and then we do an optimization step improving our policy, and then we run the new gait, and we build a physics model for the new gait, and that's how we iterate. I didn't dwell on more details of how to do this step size correctly. There's an issue of step size planning in this gradient search, but yeah, that's what we do. We update the model. I think you have a question up there.
Oh, before I give the microphone away, let me just ask my own question. I thought that your linear and velocity friction ansatz I think that's pretty interesting with pretty compelling results. I'm wondering, do you have any ideas about mathematical relationships between, or that could explain or justify the ansatz?
Yeah. So here's what I think is happening, and this is actually an insight that I greatly credit Andy Ruina putting my head on straight thinking about it. If you ask yourself for a slipping velocity, so for a non-zero velocity, if you're going to perturb that velocity around, how much will the force change? So what's the perturbation model of Coulomb friction? It turns out that that perturbation model is very linear. That is, its first order approximation happens to be very, very good. And I think this is why this is working. Because what we're really doing is we're not trying to build a model of the entire physics. We're trying to build a model of the physics around a gate. So it's a perturbation around a velocity rather than absolute dependence on the velocity. And it turns out that for that sort of perturbative analysis, Coulomb friction and viscous friction aren't that different. And in fact, tantalizingly enough, the error is about 2%, which is the modeling error we get.
Thank you so much for this talk. It was really interesting. As a paleontologist, you started speaking my language at the end there about when we started first learning gaits and things like that. When and why do you think maybe that motion in this Stoxian model stopped? So like the early worms like Pikaia and Hycuectes and things like that. was it when we got bigger or when we started mineralizing hard parts? Because when I think of things that move through these areas like today, right, like worms, nematodes, I don't think of mineralization. Whereas
So I don't think mineralization matters at all here. I think here's where it breaks down. Either in water when your Reynolds number starts being big, or when you go on land and you have a body that develops enough momentum so that its contact with the ground won't stop it immediately when your shape stops changing. So things like, say, cockroaches or spiders, I think they're still Stoxian. But when you get the animals larger or going a lot faster, then it starts breaking down. So basically, point of my talk, I think, is it breaks down a lot further down the line than you'd think. It's not at mineralization, it's not
anything more complicated than substrate. It's not going to be very hostage to the symmetry assumptions that you're making to have these strong regularities and collapses. These are not so much dynamical collapses as they are geometric, and they depend on the symmetries.
So I would say yes and no. And here's where something special happens for legged systems. Legged systems don't care about the symmetry of the environment except for their contacts, right? What the environment does where I have no feet doesn't matter. And so it's actually pretty easy to learn. You have another variable, which is where is your foot and what is the contact normal? And that's about it. So I think it's still easy to learn. I think this is where legged systems have a leg up, if you will. So they don't need the full symmetry of the environment.
There's a question in the Q&A from Tonya Shia. Hi, Shai, great talk. Question from a biologist. What does an overdamped system mean in a biological context? Is it just a soft-bodied organism? And second question from Tonya, to follow up on inclines, how about running on sand?
Okay, so two great questions. Thank you, Tonya, and I'm glad you could watch this talk. So here's what overdamped is. There's a recent paper by Ansgar Busch's group that shows that if you take stick insects and you look and you detach their muscles, their legs still go to the same position regardless of which direction you mount them, because there's just so much damping in the joints that controls where the legs end up. And in fact, when they move, they need constant muscle activation to keep themselves moving against this rubber suit in which those muscles are in that's trying to pop them back to the same position. So overdamped, in this case, means a body that will grind itself to a standstill the moment it stops pushing against its own resistance. And depending on how much friction there is, that could be different sizes of bodies, but it's usually smaller animals. So that's what I mean by overdamped. With regards to sand, I don't know the friction model in sand, how different it would be, but in principle, and this is what I learned thanks to Matt's insight, any system where momentum decays quickly enough will be governed by Stoxian-like dynamics. So the key issue here is decays fast enough. How fast is fast enough? Well, there is presumably a bifurcation that will happen there when momentum doesn't decay fast enough, and we don't know exactly where it is. But for very fast momentum decay, it is certain that there is a connection-like model, and where that connection-like model will break down depends. So if you're talking about an animal running over sand, I will ask you the following question. If you hit that animal with a sci-fi freeze ray and its body stops, how long before it slides to a standstill? If it slides to a standstill in a very short time frame compared to the time scale of the behavior, then this kind of model will probably work.
There's a follow-up from Tonya. to your answer. So does overdamped also apply to joints in larger animals? For example, hinge joints and mechanical steps of extremes?
Possibly. I would need to look at the numbers. I don't know.
I also have a question about using one model to sort of learn all the 9 different kind of motions.
Mhm.
Does that mean that what's the best strategy to choose from? Like, should I use a different kind of gates, or should I just move on like using this same model and just moving it faster and faster if I try to change the speed? Because we know that in biology, they sort of try to find the local minimum of the energy output and choose different kind of gates to run when they ramp up their speed. But in this case, it seems like we can just go faster and faster.
Well, first of all, them's fighting words, right? I don't necessarily believe that energy optimality is what governs the choice of gates for all animals. It's true for animals that travel very far, because then even a slight bit of non-optimality has a huge survival consequence. But I'm not sure that an animal running for its life is going to pick the gate that's most energy efficient versus the gate that will get it out of the predator's maw the fastest. So you always need to think in context. But this model is linear. The failure of all linear models is that linear models pretend to extend to infinity and nothing extends to infinity. How far does the linear model extend? As far as you're happy with it. All models are wrong. Okay, are you getting the result you want is what you should ask yourself. What I'm trying to say in this talk is this might extend further than you expect. Try it. But I don't know whether it extends far enough for you, or maybe it's not even good enough. Maybe the 2% error I'm getting is too much for you, right? All I'm saying is the linear model will give you about a 2% error on my kind of robots, and it works for a large range.
Protesting again your heresy about the primacy of mud and skidding in determining our motor activity. If this is really the origin of embodied intelligence, then you would expect that these small, heavily damped guys, which you're studying, would have much worse cost of transport than some of the bigger, more graceful, more dynamical things, which surely are not damped. But we see cockroaches with pretty low cost of transport compared to even, very, very graceful runners, as I recall. So how can this be, Shai?
So first, I'm actually not sure that's true. The cost of transport for small animals in general is larger. As I recall, small animals have still a much higher cost of transport per unit mass than large animals. But you could still ask this question even outside whether this is true or not. I said nothing about energy loss or where it comes from.
Well, as soon as you said damping, you said something about that.
I said damping in the sense of this is the model of the interaction of velocities and forces, but I didn't say where the energy is going out of that velocity to. So I don't know, and I'm not pretending to know what are the mechanisms that generate efficiency at different scales. I think it's a great question. I think it's a great question. If you are going to build a highly damped system, how do you do that in a way that isn't prohibitively costly energetically? I'm saying in terms of control, it will make your life really easy. I think a few of our senior colleagues have made a career of doing that. So I think that this is true, that if you're willing to waste energy willy-nilly, control becomes a lot easier. I'm just suggesting you may want to do it in the overdamped regime rather than in the dynamic regime.
I'll ask another question. You had a slide where you were talking about, I think you mentioned time-ordered exponential, and you were using the structure to parallelize the integration of the equations of motion numerically.
Yeah.
I understand that to be that time-ordered exponential to be related to the Dyson series, but there's also a thing called the Magnus expansion. And I'm wondering if you had considered using the Magnus expansion instead, if there are technical advantages to not using that with respect to the computation time.
No, I've not considered any kind of sophisticated approaches to this. I think there's a lot more work to do that well, but maybe I'm not the right guy to do it.
Shai, thank you for a terrific talk. Very, very provocative and exciting. Thank you to the audience for attending and asking very interesting questions. Thanks to everyone who joined us today.